We should start the talk. Is Brian here? Oh, right. Okay. So, Brian, I'm not sure how you pronounce your surname.
Vagts.
But, okay.
Like what's happening?
It's going to talk about Telenet, which is one of my interests.
The interesting thing about Telenet is back home, and I am from the suburbs of DC, Northern Virginia, which is actually where Telenet was based. And no one knows about Telenet, and I usually have to explain what Telenet was most of the time, and it's already come up twice today. So I feel a little bit redundant and very happy at the same time. And so a little bit about myself. I am a associate professor of history at Northern Virginia Community College. So we're a community college. We're mostly education focused rather than research focused, but periodically we break out and get to go to conferences. I'm also in the STS program at Virginia Tech, where I'm studying the history of technology. So this paper grows out of my work at Virginia Tech. And so let's just get into it because I have a hard time.
Slight technical.
Wanted to look into, and my training is as a historian, but I graduated in 1996 with a degree in philosophy, and for some reason there weren't that many philosophy jobs available in 1996, but there were tons of IT jobs. In Northern Virginia, if you had a heartbeat, you could get a job in IT. And so I worked for a number of years, not as a particularly competent IT practitioner, but an enthusiastic one, before I ran away screaming and went to grad school in history. And so I was kind of on the ground floor of, in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia had a conceit for a little bit that it was going to be the internet capital, that Silicon Valley would have the hardware, but we'd have the communications. And you still run across a gross oversimplification that Northern Virginia still has far more than its fair share of internet traffic passing through it. There we go, okay. And so what I wanted to look into is, how did people learn to behave on data networks? It didn't come from nowhere, and the internet didn't come from nowhere. This is learned behavior. And oftentimes today, there is of course a lot of people, beating their heads saying, hey, well, how is social media so toxic? Well, we have decades and decades of work going into this. And so that's what I wanted to go into, was look into that. That license plate, by the way, you can still get in Virginia. I've been tempted to get one just for sarcasm's value. But where did this come from? I didn't intend initially to start looking into security. The problem is on a documentary basis, I have not yet tracked down where the archives for Telenet was, and there's been enough corporate mergers that it could be at Verizon, it could be a number of different places. I have tracked down some people who worked at Telenet, but I'm still tracking down the archives. So I'm dependent on what is available publicly. And of course, what got people's attention publicly is going to be the security issues. And we had an interesting nexus in 1983, so a little more than 40 years ago now, where we had a mass media event in the form of the movie War Games, which unleashed Matthew Broderick upon the world, which we're very sorry about, but also a series of hacking incidents that utilized Telenet, and one of which used Telenet as basically just a vehicle for attack. It was a transport mechanism. It wasn't directly involved. But later there was attacks on the telemail email service itself. And so Telenet is both a vehicle for exploits here, as well as a victim itself. And looking into this idea of the social construction, and I'm using a common, kind of outdated, very simple theory, but I like it because I like my theories simple, called SCOT, social construction of technology. Basically, there's a feedback cycle. You have a technology, people respond to it, the technology incorporates that feedback into it. And so I wanted to see how security technology was incorporating this feedback. The hacking incidents in 1983 are pretty much your stereotypical, teenage male suburban hackers. It was a real nice, there we go, early point to address security issues before the stakes went bad, and we didn't address it. So the question is what was going on with this? So just a little bit of background on Telenet. Again, I'm arguing against, I don't think I have to tell you guys about this. ARPANET is not the beginning. ARPANET is important, but ARPANET's importance, at least in my mind, is largely developed IP. People don't care about protocols. They care about what they're doing on their networks. And as best I can tell, in 1983, Telenet is orders of magnitude larger than ARPANET was at the time period. ARPANET had, what I have up there, 113 nodes. Telenet had over 2,000 customers. It's an apples to oranges comparison, but each of those represents probably a large enterprise computer system. I don't know how to break that into absolute numbers of users, but several orders of magnitude larger. And it's going to be these users that then go on and start bringing, and in addition to TimeNet and the CompuServe and the other services of the time period, the BBS world, bringing those learned behaviors onto the internet when it starts expanding in the 1990s. So what I'm arguing against in terms of the technical construction is, okay, yeah, ARPANET is important with the IP conversion, the development of those protocols, but the social basis is much more bifurcated. And please forgive me, this is very much a US focused look at this. Telenet was active in the United Kingdom. In my research, that never came up, but there were clients and we did have connections to the United Kingdom. So already talked about that for the most part, not the first hacking incidents, but as far as I can tell, this is the first time, and again, largely because of the movie, where people started paying attention to it. And what we saw in most of these cases, just theoretical model, basically using Scott. If you're familiar with it, I like it, is how did we respond to these hacking incidents? How did the technology change? And at first I was really disappointed. I'm like, there's no changes. And in fact, it's almost like a broken record. What led to all of these systems being penetrated was the fact that the passwords were horrible. And once again, we saw, if you watch the movie War Games, at one point in time, the protagonist breaks into the school computer because the password was pencil. On the Telenet systems, it was documented that a lot of passwords were the person's first name. And if you're an administrator, you had a capital A afterwards. Well, guess which the hackers went after. You can take this story and repeat it for decades and decades and decades. The security didn't develop to incorporate this feedback. And I'm like, well, what the heck's going on here? That's not how it works. And there were some mechanisms, they were cumbersome, but there were some mechanisms at the time period, like callback modems. A couple of years later, the RSA secure ID tokens came out and had a very slow uptick. But we don't see an effective response to this. And a year after that, we get the TRW hacks of credit card information and stuff. So it's very rapidly escalating in costs. And I came across this ad right here. And I think, if I remember correctly, I did not put the text on the next page. How Telenet responded to this was interesting. When you go through the literature at the time period, most people thought that hacking was wrong, but they weren't quite sure why. US code at the time was ambiguous on whether it was legal or not. It had strong wiretapping protections. You can't mess with data when it's being transmitted, but if it's in storage on a computer, then what do you do with that? There was a conflation between software piracy and what these kids were doing. And these kids were basically just messing around, but they weren't pirates as far as I can tell. And some people are like, well, they're not pirating commercial software, there's no crime here. And what Telenet ultimately did is launch this campaign trying to associate hacking with criminal activity. And they're playing kind of a two-pronged approach here. It's like, oh yeah, these kids are just organized dupes. But there's a reference that comes up repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly that this is a front for organized crime. This is a front for the mafia, which as far as I can tell, at the time period, is not. But later is almost prescient. It does tie into that. And so we see in response to this, there's not much of a change in the technology. This is what I was expecting. And if you can combine the blue in the yellow, we get green. It would incorporate the feedback. I thought I was quite clever at that. You'd incorporate that feedback and we'd get change in these systems. That's not actually what happened. What we saw, let me go back, sorry, is that this resulted in social change. This is going to, it's not the whole process, but we start defining out this idea of unauthorized computer access as a new form of crime, as a new criminal action in and of its own right. And in doing so, we kicked the can down the road for decades, and I'd say we only really effectively started addressing this, what, 5 years ago, maybe? That passwords do not, in theory, should be awesome. In reality, very seldom is. And that, in essence, we refuse to deal with that technological feedback from this early time period. This is the text of the article. If anyone knows who that guy is in the bottom right, if you can let me know. I've never figured that out. I've asked everybody. No one knows who that is. He's bad. Just not sure who he is.
Yes. In writing.
And what ultimately see is what is driving this is the concern, and once again, this is no surprise here. I guess what surprised me is that this pattern was as old as it is. Cost, ease of use trumps everything else, and that no one likes the idea of bad security, but it's never enough to overcome those other factors there. And if the paper is currently in early access on the IEEE Annals of the History of Computing. And if anyone wants to ask me, I can send out an accepted version once it goes published. But that should be up, and it's already up in early access form. Broke it out kind of by the different groups going into it. Ultimately, security was, and I would argue still is, probably a secondary element, and that is really, really messed with us long term.